Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I have a different sort of video for you, but the one that I thought would be fun to do and one that I've been thinking about doing for a little while. And that is basically recommending what I recommend for people to get into with the Cosmere, what I recommend to start with, all that kind of stuff, kind of pitching all of the different books and series, so you can see what you think you want to start with. This is a topic that I'm sure has been covered plenty by lots of other people. And so I don't know necessarily how much new I have to say here, but it's something that I did want to talk about because I myself have recommended Cosmere books to people. I have gifted Cosmere books to someone, things like that. So I have a lot of feelings on what I think works best for people to start with and things like that. And so that's what I'm going to be doing in this video. So if you have been thinking about checking out some of Brandon Sanderson's books in the Cosmere, and you don't know where to start, or you want to just get a kind of basic overview of all the different books and see what appeals to you most, then you are in the right place. So I'm basically going to be covering a lot of the main series and main books in the Cosmere, going over each of them, pitching them just a little bit, talking a little bit about what they're all about, and whether or not I recommend that you start with them. There are a few caveats to this. First of all, I'm only including, obviously, his Cosmere work, so you won't be seeing stuff like Skyward or The Reckoners or anything like that, because first of all, they're not Cosmere, and second of all, I have not read them. So far, all I've read of his is the Cosmere. So there's that. Also, I'm not fully caught up on the Cosmere yet. I am very close to being there. I have not read the last Mistborn book, and I also have not read the last couple of Secret Project books, which are Yumi and the Nightmare Painter and The Sunlit Man. From what I have heard, as far as the two secret projects, a lot of people I've seen have said that Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is a decent starting point, and The Sunlit Man is not, because it is very Cosmere heavy in terms of references. I can't speak to that, obviously, because I haven't read them, but if you are wondering about those, then there you go. You might want to look elsewhere in terms of if you're interested in either of those and seeing what people have to say about them. But I, at this point, have read basically everything else. So that's my credentials for doing this video. So very first thing, very basic, like, where do I think you can start? This is just kind of a basic overview, so if you only watch a little bit of this video, you get this. So where do I think you can start in the Cosmere? I think you can start basically anywhere, is the answer, depending on what you're looking for, of course. But I think all of the standalones, basically, and all of the series, you can start with any of them if you want to. Obviously, you can't start in the middle of a series. You can't start on book 3 of a series, for example. But if you want to start with Mistborn Era 1, if you want to start with Mistborn Era 2, if you want to start with Stormlight Archive, if you want to start with Tress of the Emerald Sea, Warbreaker, Elantris, any of that stuff, I think that's all fair game. I think, obviously, it depends on what you want out of it. If you're not looking for a giant epic fantasy, then you probably shouldn't start with the Stormlight Archive. But if you are interested in that sort of thing, then I think that you can literally start anywhere if you really want to. So as far as what I'm going to be actually recommending, I'm just going to kind of talk about each series and what I think they do well, so that you can see which one appeals to you the most. The other thing that I wanted to say really quick is I feel like this is something that some Sanderson fans might disagree with, who are very much into Sanderson, because Sanderson fans tend to be very dedicated to his work and really push it for recommending it to people. But if you do not want to get into the whole Cosmere, you do not have to. I want to make that point, because even though I'm going to be talking about a lot of different Cosmere stuff in this video, if I talk about something in this video and you're like, I want to read that, but I don't want to read this other thing, that is totally fine. Obviously just read what appeals to you. And even though, it is really cool to get all the connections between series, it is not required to read all of these books. People like myself who are big fans of Sanderson will do that, but it is not required at all. well for everybody who gets into his work. Also, real quick, just kind of pitching the Cosmere to you in case you're not entirely aware of what it is. The Cosmere is basically the interconnected universe of Brandon Sanderson's fantasy books. It does not encapsulate everything he has written. He has some series that are not within the Cosmere, like Skyward or The Reckoners, which I'm not going to talk about in this video, first of all, because they're not Cosmere, and also I haven't read them yet. But the Cosmere is basically a set of many different books that are in their own independent series or are standalones that can function by themselves but are interconnected by being within the same, I believe it's supposed to be like a dwarf galaxy. So that each series takes place on a different planet within this galaxy. So there are references between books in some cases, and there's going to be some crossover in the future. There even is some crossover already, which is, you know, noticeable for people who are fans, but if you are only reading one series, then most of the time it's not really going to affect your enjoyment. Yeah, so the Cosmere basically is just this interconnected book universe between different series, which is really cool. So let's get into the actual recommendations now that I've got all that stuff out of the way. First thing I'm going to talk about is if you want something short and sweet but still shows what Sanderson can do, and that is The Emperor's Soul. This is a novella that I read over the summer, and it's really good. In fact, I believe it is the only one of Sanderson's works that has won awards, which is really cool. I think it won a Hugo or something like that. But this is, the basic pitch for this is it is a very small scale story, basically entirely taking place in one room with just a couple of characters, with this character who needs to, if I'm remembering correctly, is tasked with reforging the Emperor's soul, and uses the magic of this world to do that. And that's kind of the basic pitch, if you want that. This is a good one for several reasons. First of all, like I mentioned, it's short and sweet, so if you want something that's really quick, really easy to read, like quickly, you know, something you can read in like an afternoon if you really want to, this is a really good choice. This is a good one if you want something small scale, if you want something very character focused. I think this book does a great job of showing how well Sanderson can write his characters. And you also get a good sense of the magic, because one of the things he's most known for is his magic. And even though this magic system is not used as in depth as in many of his other books, because it is just a short, like 100 and some page novella, you know, you get a good sense of what his magic is like as well. So this is a good one if you want to get a good sense of several aspects of Sanderson's writing in a very short package. The next thing I'm going to talk about is going to be the thing that you're going to get most recommended to you if you're getting into Sanderson, which is the Mistborn trilogy. Mistborn is an interesting series because it is a big series that is planned to be, you know, lots of books, like over 10 books, but it includes multiple sub-series, which at the moment only 2 of them are out. But from what I understand, in terms of these 2 series, they are at least fairly independent. They definitely build off each other, but they are fairly independent as well if you just want to read one or the other. And I assume that the other sub-series will probably be like that as well. But first I'm going to talk about the original Mistborn trilogy, which is Mistborn: The Final Empire, The Well of Ascension, and The Hero of Ages. This is actually the one that I started with, so I may be a little biased talking about this one because it is the one I started with, and it is the one that I would most heavily recommend for people getting into the Cosmere. But I think it is a very good one to start with for sure. I think it, again, kind of similar to Emperor's Soul, gives you a good showing of everything Sanderson does really well. Quick little cut in here because I was editing and I completely forgot to mention some things. First, Mistborn, I forgot to mention what the premise for this book is. So the premise for this book basically is, what if the Dark Lord won? What if the hero who is prophesied to save the world and everything went and ended up losing to the Dark Lord anyway? That's the basic premise of this book that Sanderson often gives. As far as the first book actual premise of it, part of it is a heist, and the rest is kind of trying to overthrow the Dark Lord's empire, is basically the premise for this book. You get a lot of good character stuff in this trilogy, good character arcs both across singular books as well as the entire trilogy. You get a lot of good world building, which was not as prevalent in The Emperor's Soul, so if you want something with a little more world building, you get that here. You get a lot of good action, you get a lot of good magic stuff with a very interesting magic system. Just generally, this is a very good, solid trilogy that I think is really good for people who are just getting into the Cosmere. And I think there's a good reason why people recommend that if you're going to start the Cosmere, you start with Mistborn. Another thing that I really like about Mistborn, actually, before I talk about that, also, if you are interested in romance, this trilogy has, I think, one of the better romances that Sanderson has written. I think generally that's one of his weaker aspects of his writing, but I do think the romance in this trilogy is pretty solid. It's a little rocky at the start, in my opinion, but as it goes along, it gets better. Another thing that I really like about the first Mistborn trilogy is the structure of it basically allows for you to just read the first book if you want to. So if you want something where you can read the first book, and then if you want to stop there, if you're not really feeling it, you still got a complete story. But if you want to continue, there is more there. The first book, even though it does leave some things open for future books, does have its own plot arc that is resolved by the end of the book, its own character arcs that are resolved by the end of the book, all that kind of stuff. So if you just want to read one book when you finish it and you're just like, I don't feel like continuing this series, then you can just read the first book and feel good about it. Which is, I think, one of the other big advantages of Mistborn, is that option for when you finish it, you can either continue or not, and feel like you still got a complete story either way. The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually Mistborn Era 2, which is fairly logical because I just talked about Era 1. The way that Mistborn is structured is that each sub-series is a different era within the same world. So you have Mistborn Era 1, which is kind of more typical fantasy type setting. Then you have Mistborn Era 2, which is a few hundred years later, and covers different characters, different plot lines, but still has its connections to the first era and is still set in the same world, but during a different technological age and things like that. This kind of takes place more kind of Victorian era kind of thing. This is another one that I would not recommend as heavily starting with, but like I said earlier, I think you can basically start anywhere in the Cosmere if you really want to. I do think that starting with the first era and then reading Era 2 makes a lot of the stuff in Era 2 hit a little harder because you're seeing how things connect. Obviously, you can, if you want to start here. It is fairly standalone, at least in the first 3 books. I have not read the 4th book of Era 2. But the first 3 books at least are fairly standalone. There is definitely crossover with the first era, but if you want to start with Era 2, you probably could. I just personally wouldn't recommend doing that. The basic premise for this is it's much more of kind of a detective western type of thing, set in a fantasy world, which is really cool, and I really enjoy it. It is very different tonally from the first era, so if you decide to jump into this one after Era 1, do keep in mind that it is very different in tone, in basically every way, or not every way maybe, but in a lot of ways. The way the story is, the way the tone is, the state of the world, all that stuff is very different. So do keep that in mind. Next one I'm going to talk about is actually, I'm going to lump together the standalones, because I think those are the next logical recommendation that I would have for you can start here, because obviously these are standalones. You don't need to read anything else to get these books. So the ones I'm going to talk about are Warbreaker, Elantris, and Tress of the Emerald Sea. So I do think that you can start also with any of these 3. I think that, they're standalone books. There are planned sequels for at least 2 of these. Elantris and Warbreaker are planned to have sequels in the coming years, but currently are standalones, and I assume they will still function as standalones if you want to do that. Kind of similar to Mistborn, where I assume if more books are written for those 2 series, you can probably still read the first book as a standalone. But currently they're standalones. Out of these, the one I would most recommend to start with is Warbreaker, which is kind of a A woman is sent off to marry a character named the God King by her family. And her sister was the one that was meant to be sent off, but she ends up getting sent off instead. And so that causes a whole bunch of shenanigans, but then her sister is freaking out about that, so then she goes to follow her and try to rescue her. Basic plot overview there. This one, I think, does a lot of things that Mistborn does really well. A lot of good character stuff, a lot of good world building, a lot of good magic. I think this one especially is good if you want some humor to your book. I think the humor in this book is excellent and wonderful and amazing. And is probably the one out of the 3 standalones is the one that I would most recommend. I think Mistborn and Warbreaker, for me personally, granted they are the ones that I started with, so I might have some bias there. But for me, I would say those are the ones, if I were to point anyone towards the 2 things that I would recommend to start with when it comes to the Cosmere, I would point at these. The next one is Elantris, which is the first published book by Brandon Sanderson. This is also a good starting place. I would not say it's the best starting place just because I think it is a bit of a weaker book. I don't think it is necessarily as weak as some other people say. A lot of people say this is very easily his weakest book. I think it's still really, really good because I love every Sanderson book that I have read so far. But I do definitely think it is on the weaker side, and I do think that you will get more out of starting with something like Mistborn or Warbreaker. But this is a very good book either way. Basic idea of this is a character is afflicted with this thing, I think, called the Shiad, which basically turns you into this kind of zombie-like person. And he is then thrown into the completely like abandoned city of Elantris. It's not abandoned because basically everyone who is afflicted with this disease is thrown into the city, but it is basically, you know, him being afflicted with this thing, but then trying to also figure out all the mysteries of the city and trying to get the people of the city back to their former glory, basically. This is a good book, but I, again, would not recommend starting with it personally, but again, you definitely can if you want to. Another cut in here for Elantris. One thing I do think is important to note for this one, and another reason I don't recommend it as heavily, is because it is a much slower book. A lot of the other books that I have talked about, like Mistborn and Warbreaker, I think are much better paced for a first book. This one's a bit slower, so if that is something that you're not as into, then you may want to steer clear of this one as far as a first book. But if that's not something that bothers you, then again, you could still go with this one as a first book. The last standalone that I'm going to talk about is Tress of the Emerald Sea. This is another one that I think, again, you could start with, but I would not recommend it. This is one very fairy tale-esque. So if that's something that you're looking for, this might actually be a good one to start with, as well as having a lot of good humor to it. The basic premise for this one is that Tress is lives on this island, and she is in love with this guy who gets whisked away, and she goes off on a ship to go and rescue him. And it is told from the perspective of a character who is a character who within the Cosmere who is telling you this story. So it has a very strong sense of voice to the prose, which is really nice. A lot of humor comes from this character as well. So if you're looking for something with a very unique voice to it, this is also a good one to read. But the reason why I would not recommend this one as much for beginners in the Cosmere is because this is a character who is very prominent within the Cosmere. And so there are lots of references to other books, which I think probably you wouldn't really miss anything if this was your first Cosmere book. But I think there are enough references that it might throw people off if they start with this. But I could totally be wrong on that. Last cut in this video, I swear. Another reason why I think this one doesn't work as well as a first book is because it is very different from Sanderson's usual style. The other books that I have recommended, even like every other book basically in this video, is a better representation of his usual style, whereas this one is very heavily stylized because of the unique voice of the narrator. So I think even though the actual, like, it's a good book to start with if this sort of thing sounds appealing to you, but I do think that the very different style of it makes it not as good of a first book to get into. And the last thing that I'm going to discuss in this video is the Stormlight Archive. This is Brandon's big epic fantasy series where all the books are like 1,200 pages. This is an incredible series. In my opinion, this series is Brandon's best work. I have so far read the first 3 books, and I am currently, at the time of recording this, in the process of reading book 4. And so far, all 3 of those first books, as well as so far book 4, are at the very top of Brandon's books for me in terms of, if I were to rank them, these are all way high up there. So I think these books are definitely Brandon's best work. If you want something with amazing world building, with a very unique and interesting world, the world within this series is unlike anything that I've ever seen, really. And great character work in many ways, especially in regards to mental health. Great magic, really interesting magic. Personally, magic that I don't find as interesting as some of his others, but still really cool. And just a big epic scope. If you're looking for, if you are an epic fantasy fan and you love to have your books, like if a book being able to be a doorstop is appealing to you, you may want to start with this series. The basic premise for this is difficult to say because it is such a big, expansive, and ambitious series, but it focuses on all of these different characters and the return of the Knights Radiant, which is this ancient, not ancient race, but this ancient group that is now returning to stop this greater threat that is threatening this world. And, you know, it has definitely the big epic fantasy feel to it. And if you're a fan of epic fantasy, then you can definitely jump right into this. Again, though, this is one that I would caution you against starting with if you are not already you know, into giant fantasy books or something like that. When I first read this series, the only really big fantasy books that I had read the first Wheel of Time book, and I had read some of the A Song of Ice and Fire books, which the first book of this series I think is longer than any of those that I had read at the time. And definitely had a lot of stuff going on. So if you are not used to that, then this one may be a bit off-putting for you to start with. I think you certainly still could, because I think everything about these books are still interesting enough to still be able to draw you in, even if you are starting with them. And Brandon's writing style is easy enough to get into that I think the confusion level will be relatively minimal. It does have a pretty big learning curve because it is a really big world with a lot of stuff going on. So the learning curve for the first book, getting into it, is fairly high. But I think it is definitely still manageable if you want to start with it. But I think if you are a little bit unsure, first of all, if you've never read Brandon Sanderson before and you're not sure if you're willing to commit to it, but also if you're not quite into these gigantic fantasy books, I think starting again with Mistborn or Warbreaker, or one of the other ones that I talked about, would probably be the better option. But if you are already into epic fantasy and you are willing to commit to a massive series, then I think this is a decent place to start as well. Just if you're not into that, then maybe start somewhere else. So that pretty much wraps up this video. I know this was a little different from my usual sort of thing that I do, but I thought it would be fun. And I hope that if you are looking to get into the Cosmere, you've found this video at least somewhat informative. If there is something that I did not talk about in this video, for example, some of the short stories and novellas, I personally just wouldn't recommend starting with those because a lot of those build off of other stories. So I just would not recommend starting with any of those aside from The Emperor's Soul. But I would still recommend reading them once you are into the Cosmere, personally. I think that pretty much wraps up everything that I had to talk about. So let me know in the comments if you already are into the Cosmere and for some reason are watching this video, what you think of my recommendations, what you would most recommend for people to start with, and all that stuff. And if you have not gotten into the Cosmere, but this video piqued your interest, let me know in the comments which one of these you think you might start with, which one you find most interesting. I mean, of course, if you are one of those people who has not gotten into the Cosmere and are watching this video to figure that out, if you have any questions about any of these series, feel free to leave those in the comments as well, and I would be happy to answer them. So that pretty much wraps up this video, so thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.